August 17, 1943. Morning skies over Schweinfurt, Germany. Lieutenant Dietrich Hager of Jagdgeschwader 3 tightened the straps of his flight harness, already soaked through with sweat, as he banked his Bf-109G into the early sun. The contrails were everywhere, long, thick, twisting strands slashing across the upper altitudes in parallel arcs like scars in the sky. His radio hissed, crackled, then spat a frantic warning. "Het zijn uur drie staffel, Amerikaner zijn kilometer, 40 maskenen mindestens." He looked up, not just one stream, not even two, four separate bomber formations, each flanked by a growing cloud of escorts. And then he saw them. The bombers moved like a fortress wall, B-17s in staggered combat boxes, blotting out the blue. But it wasn't them that made his stomach clench. It was the slivers racing above and beside them. American fighters, dozens of them, Thunderbolts and the newer P-51 Mustangs, sleek, fast, murderously calm in their maneuvering. He blinked twice. There were more now. A whole flight appeared behind the first, then another, and another. Then a voice behind him muttered, dazed, "Mein Gott, they're multiplying." Hager squinted into the glare and realized it wasn't his imagination. Every pass his comrades made seemed to take down 2, maybe 3 fighters. But it didn't matter. More came. There were always more. At first he thought his altimeter had malfunctioned. The dots just kept appearing but not rising, not diving, just arriving, like they'd always been there. Then came the sound. It was subtle at first, not the high-pitched scream of the Daimler-Benz engine behind his head, but a low, distant rumble like the sound of air itself being torn apart. It wasn't one plane. It wasn't 10. It was a factory in the sky. The squadron dove, and the dogfight exploded over the fields of Schweinfurt. Hager's 109 rolled into the fray, eyes locked on a P-47 slicing across his squadron leader's tail. The Thunderbolt peeled away, absorbing a burst of cannon fire like armor plate. He followed, climbing behind it, but the moment he lined up his shot, another American fighter appeared on his 6. He broke off, dove hard, inverted over a row of farmhouses, clipped a radio mast, pulled up just in time, only to have another Thunderbolt ride his exhaust trail. It was like trying to fight a swarm of steel wasps. He dove again, leveling over the treetops. Behind him, his wingman vanished in a trail of black smoke. Another comrade's voice cut out mid-scream on the radio. The moment he clawed altitude again, the sky was different, filled with new contrails, new machines, fresh fighters. They were supposed to be outnumbered. The Luftwaffe had 180 fighters scrambled in the air, but it didn't feel like enough. Not anymore. "Where do they keep coming from?" someone muttered on the open channel. No one answered. Back at the field 2 hours later, Hager slid out of his cockpit, hands shaking. Oil sprayed across the cowling, his left aileron half torn. The ground crew rushed to inspect damage, but Hager just stood there, staring upward at the sky, still stitched with contrails and smudges of black flak bursts. They'd lost 24 aircraft. His staffel was down to 6 flyable fighters. And still the Americans came. He said nothing as the mechanics checked his plane. Inside his mind, something cracked. This wasn't a bad day. This wasn't just one brutal raid. This was something else. He walked into the command tent, sweat-soaked and pale, and dropped his helmet onto the table. "They're not fighting with planes anymore," he said. "They're fighting with factories." No one spoke. He wasn't wrong. In the span of a single year, the United States had produced 23,000 fighter aircraft. Germany, with all its engineering pride and brutal efficiency, had barely built a third of that. And for every Bf-109 lost in combat, it took weeks to build another. The Americans replaced theirs in days. The Luftwaffe's greatest pilots were now flying daily against an enemy that could afford to lose men. That night the command staff met behind closed doors. Reports poured in from the Western Front. British reconnaissance had confirmed what they feared. Another wave of American fighters had arrived in England. 2 whole new groups. They weren't losing the air war because their pilots lacked skill. They were losing because the other side was playing a different game. Back at the airfield, Hager sat on an overturned crate beside his aircraft, smoking in silence. The mechanics worked under floodlights, patching bullet holes, bending aluminum back into shape. One of the younger ground crew asked quietly, "Herr Lieutenant, how many did we shoot down today?" Hager took a long drag from his cigarette. "Enough to make a difference," he lied. But he knew the truth. He downed 1 Thunderbolt that morning, maybe 2, but there were more now than when he took off, and tomorrow there'd be more still. That night as he lay in his bunk staring at the canvas ceiling, he didn't think about tactics, or radio procedures, or climb rates. He thought about factories. Lines of them. Endless lines, somewhere in Detroit or Buffalo or Los Angeles, pouring out Thunderbolts and Mustangs faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. He imagined a room where they pressed steel wings like loaves of bread, riveted by men who would never see the war. The next morning before first light, a siren wailed, another incoming raid. And without thinking, he rose from his bunk, strapped on his flight gear, and headed back toward the cockpit. Not because he believed in victory, but because the sky no longer waited. 2 weeks later, Dietrich Hager sat in the back of a transport truck rumbling through the chalk fields of Reims. His transfer orders had been unexpected, suddenly pulled from Jagdgeschwader 3 and reassigned to a new defensive unit stationed in northern France. No explanation given, only a new location and a new objective: repel the Allied air umbrella. That phrase stuck with him, air umbrella. It sounded benign, even polite, but Hager had seen it with his own eyes. It wasn't an umbrella, it was a ceiling that never cracked. As the truck rolled to a stop beside a dirt runway carved hastily into farmland, he saw them, his new squadron. The old familiar lines of BF-109s and FW-190s sat in rough rows, their paint dulled, their fuselages scarred by months of frantic sorties. Ground crews moved with mechanical haste, stuffing belts into MG-151 cannons, checking tire pressure, changing engine oil blackened with overuse. The commanding officer met him with a grim handshake. "We scramble 4 times a day now, sometimes more. You'll fly immediately." No briefing, no orientation, just back into the sky. They lifted off that same afternoon, a dozen fighters climbing on intercept orders. American bombers had been spotted northeast of Rouen, another raid headed for the rail yards. They crested altitude just as the contrails came into view. B-17s again, always B-17s. Formations so tight they looked like floating cities, and around them the escorts, P-51s in flocks, silver gleaming against the cold blue. The P-51 Mustang was a different kind of threat. It wasn't just fast, it was elegant. It seemed to glide where the 109 had to fight gravity. It could turn faster, climb longer, and, thanks to its belly tank range, stay in the fight far longer than it had any right to. And they were everywhere. Within seconds of contact, Hager's radio became a scream. Fighters dove from above in perfect coordination, splitting the German formation before it even reached the bombers. A P-51 caught his wingman with a deflection burst that tore the fuselage in 2. Another darted beneath him and raked the belly of a nearby 190, sending it tumbling like a broken toy. Hager pulled hard into a spiral, rolling out behind one of the Mustangs. He fired short bursts from the cannon. The P-51 twisted out, dancing through the cloud cover. He followed. The sky turned into a carousel of chaos. Then something happened he hadn't expected. He hit one. A lucky burst. He watched the Mustang's engine cough black smoke, and the pilot ejected seconds before it dove into the woods below. But he didn't celebrate. Because for everyone he hit, there were 5 more. For every Mustang that vanished, another took its place. The escorts didn't shrink, they expanded. The bombers reached their target. Reams vanished under clouds of black smoke and fire. Back on the runway, hours later, Hager counted 4 planes returning from their original 12. They hadn't reached the bombers, not even close. Inside the debriefing hut, someone finally said what no one wanted to. "We're not intercepting raids anymore. We're dying in front of factories." It was true in every measurable way. In July 1943 alone, American plants produced over 2,000 new P-47 Thunderbolts. In August, they delivered 700 P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe, by comparison, had lost 800 aircraft in the month before Hager's transfer, and built barely 600. The losses weren't just in machines, they were in men. The ace pilots of 1940 were gone now, either dead or grounded from fatigue. What replaced them were teenagers, half-trained cadets shoved into cockpits and told to fight against a tidal wave. Hager remembered the faces of the new arrivals. 18, maybe 19. Barely old enough to shave. Some didn't even have time to choose a squadron emblem before they vanished into smoke. He began to mark time differently, not in days, but in raids. 2 raids before breakfast, another afternoon, 1 before sundown. Sometimes he flew 3 times a day, sometimes 4. The Americans didn't rest. They were in the sky when the sun rose, and they were still there when it fell. And they never looked tired. The logistics reports were the most chilling. One technician had confided the numbers. The United States had shipped over 12,000 fighters to Europe in just 6 months. Their training schools graduated nearly 7,000 pilots in the same period. German oil reserves were collapsing. Aviation fuel was being rationed. It was not a war anymore, it was math. Hager didn't believe in miracles. But in the autumn of 1944, when the P-47s were joined by hundreds more P-51s fitted with the Merlin engine, he understood something he could never say aloud. Even if they shot down 100 planes a day, they would still lose. And worse, the Americans didn't seem angry anymore. They flew like men on assignment, calm, efficient, as if their job wasn't war but accounting. 1 for 1, then 2 for 1, then 5 for 1. In one fight over the Ardennes, Hager counted 17 Luftwaffe fighters downed in a single engagement. In return, the Americans lost 4. But the next morning the same group was back, whole, undamaged, smiling. It wasn't just the planes, it was the system, the spare parts, the fuel, the maps, the coordination. Every element of the American war machine worked as if it had been born for this. He began to hate that sound, Mustangs overhead, not because they brought death, but because they brought certainty. One morning, he stood on the edge of the tarmac watching a fresh batch of FW-190s being towed from the hangars. His crew chief approached, a clipboard in hand. "We've got 10 ready for today, repaired, full fuel." Hager didn't answer right away. He looked up at the horizon, contrails again, thin white threads crossing toward the heartland. 10 fighters, maybe enough to stall a single flight, maybe enough to down a bomber or 2, but behind those were hundreds more, and behind those a continent of machinery. He turned toward the airframe, already hearing the pre-flight checks. "I'll be in the air in 5 minutes. He paused, then added quietly, "But if you want my advice, don't bother repainting the tail numbers. They won't last long enough to matter." By November 1944, the sun no longer rose in silence over western Germany. It arrived trailing the sound of American engines. From his cot inside a wooden barrack near Koblenz, Dietrich Hager woke to that sound every morning now, low, constant, mechanical thunder on the edge of hearing. You didn't even need an alarm anymore. You just opened your eyes and knew they were coming. First it was the distant growl of P-47s on patrol. Then, within hours, the roar of bomber streams heading east, Mustang escorts draped around them like iron cloaks. There were no longer individual raids to prepare for. The raids were constant. The air war wasn't a rhythm anymore. It was a wall. His new airfield sat among orchards stripped bare by artillery. What remained of the Luftwaffe's fighter command had been broken into fragments, disconnected Gruppen scattered across craters and railway sidings, scrambling up whenever the sky darkened with contrails. Hager's squadron had flown 32 sorties in the past 2 weeks. He had survived all of them. Others hadn't. Each mission began with a whisper from the tower. Incoming 400 bombers, possible escort Vector 270. They never said good luck anymore, just numbers, range, altitude, speed. And every mission ended the same way, with fewer men on the ground. He no longer flinched when the pilots didn't return. Their bunks just stayed empty. No ceremony, no farewells, only a quiet rearrangement of duty boards. One cold morning, just after dawn, the group commander summoned Hager into a small, dimly lit room at the edge of the airfield. There was no coffee, no chairs, only a map, a fogged-up window, and a new briefing. "You'll be flying south," the officer said. "They're hitting our fuel depots near Ludwigshafen. Your job is to delay them. Even 10 minutes would help." "How many?" Hager asked. "Over 1,000, mixed formation. P-51s at high cover, Thunderbolts at low." He didn't reply, just nodded once. The officer hesitated. "Dietrich, it's not about stopping them anymore. It's about reminding them we're still here." It was a new kind of mission. Not victory, not even defense. Symbolism. That morning, Hager climbed into his 109 and rolled down a runway lined with the ghosts of better days. He had 20 minutes of fuel, 400 rounds, 1 cannon, and the certain knowledge that the sky was already theirs. They climbed into it anyway. Within 12 minutes, the horizon lit up with black puffs of flak and silver specks moving in endless streams. He saw the bombers first, dozens, then hundreds. They stretched across the sky like metal fields. Each one moved as part of a perfect machine. Then the fighters came, Mustangs in perfect line abreast, cutting through the upper cloud layers with eerie silence. It was beautiful, almost artistic. For a moment, Hager forgot it was war. Then it began. He broke left and dove into the formation with 2 wingmen. They aimed for the leading edge, hoping to knock a bomber or 2 from the formation before the P-51s reacted. Hager's burst clipped a B-17's left engine. Smoke burst outward. The bomber wobbled, dipped, but held formation. Then the wall closed. 2 Mustangs dropped in from above, moving like liquid through the air. One peeled off, tracked his wingman, and fired a clean burst that tore the 109 in half. Hager broke hard right, dove into the cloud deck, and pulled into a climb again. The sky was full of them, planes everywhere, silver, fast, calm. He circled once, twice, fired again. Maybe he hit something, he couldn't tell. The fight lasted 12 minutes. Then he was alone. He turned back toward the west, fuel gauge blinking red, smoke trailing from his left wing. He landed with flaps jammed, brakes screaming, skidding to a stop just short of a crater at the far end of the field. The mechanics didn't cheer. No one saluted. They just walked to the aircraft and started repairs, quietly, automatically. Inside the ready room, another pilot sat staring at a torn flight glove. Someone had scrawled a list of names on the wall, those who hadn't returned this week. 10 names, 2 days. Hager lit a cigarette and stared at the ceiling. Smoke rose into the cracks above him, mingling with the diesel fumes from the generator. He didn't speak for a long time. That night news came from Berlin. The Americans had launched a new wave over the Ruhr. They'd hit 39 separate rail junctions in a single day. 39. And they'd already replaced every aircraft lost that morning. The figures on the blackboard in the operations shack told the story better than any report. America's current fighter production rate, 1 plane every 27 minutes. Luftwaffe fighter loss rate, 1 plane every 11 minutes. Average German aircraft turnaround time for repairs, 3 days. American repair window, 12 hours. It wasn't just strategy, it wasn't bravery. It was velocity. Hager began to see it not as a war but as a tide. The more they killed, the faster the sea came back. He remembered watching a Mustang crash once near the Belgian frontier, the pilot surviving, crawling free. The very next day, another Mustang was flying that exact patrol route. He thought, did they even notice he was missing? The Americans weren't replacing men and machines. They were replacing events. By January 1945, they were being called ghost squadrons. They flew with radio silence. They attacked from altitudes never seen before. They flew low, strafed trains, tore up columns, then vanished into the clouds before the Germans even returned fire. One day, Hager flew a recon loop alone. He crossed into French airspace and counted 3 separate formations inside 15 minutes. 3, each one larger than his entire regional command. He didn't engage. He returned to base and told the commander, "If I had fired, it would have been suicide. If I had survived, I would have done nothing. They're too many." The commander simply nodded. "You made the right call." By February, even that sort of honesty had become acceptable. There were no lectures anymore, no shaming, only silence. He began to understand what surrender felt like, not as a moment, but as a process. A long, slow realization that the fight wasn't between equals. He spoke with a captured American pilot once after the man laid out behind their lines, a Mustang ace from the 8th Air Force. Calm, polite. When asked how many missions he had flown, the man answered, 47. 47, Hager had repeated, and still alive. The man had just shrugged. Our odds are good, and our logistics are better. It wasn't arrogance, it was confidence, and confidence was lethal. One night, while checking maps under candlelight, Hager found himself scribbling in the margins of a briefing chart. It was nonsense at first, numbers, ratios, shapes. Then it became clear what he was doing. He was drawing a graph, one axis for German aircraft, one for American. The lines had already crossed. And they were still moving in opposite directions. By the time March arrived, their fuel reserves were down to 11%. Spare parts arrived in boxes too small to be useful. The mechanics salvaged metal from wrecks just to patch airworthy frames. But the Americans, they had whole airfields of reserve squadrons. He heard of one raid where the U.S. launched fighters just to relieve the fighters already in the air. Shift changes, mid-mission. That was the moment he stopped believing they could win. Not because he feared death, he had made peace with that. But because the enemy had stopped being people. The enemy had become scale. In the first week of April 1945, a rumor spread like smoke through the Luftwaffe's forward airstrips. The Americans had crossed the Rhine. Not at a single bridge, not at a bottleneck the Germans could stall, but everywhere, simultaneously, river by river, field by field. By the time Dietrich Hager heard it confirmed, the Americans were already in Kassel, and they brought their sky with them. The airfield outside Magdeburg where he'd been reassigned was barely functional. The tarmac was cratered. Hangars half collapsed. The fuel depot had been hit 2 weeks earlier and hadn't been replenished since. They were operating on captured French diesel and cans of aviation fuel hidden in barns. What planes they had were stitched together from 3 or 4 wrecks. Each morning, the mechanics prayed the engines would hold. Some planes had to be started by hand. But the Americans still came. Every day, every hour. P-47s roared overhead in groups of 16, 24, 30. They strafed roads, locomotives, anything that moved. The sky wasn't even a battlefield anymore. It was owned. On April 7th, Hager climbed into a 190 with a cracked canopy and mismatched wings. The order was to intercept a group of American Thunderbolts flying recon over Leipzig. The Germans had 3 operational fighters. 3. As they gained altitude, he scanned the western horizon. Nothing at first. Then the glint, hundreds of them. Not just fighters, bombers too. The entire formation moved like a single breathing organism. He didn't even try to count them. One of the younger pilots muttered over the radio, "They look endless." Hager didn't reply, but in his gut he knew that was the truth. They were endless, not just in number, in momentum. They dove in together. He fired a short burst and peeled away as a wave of Mustangs arced down in perfect synchrony. It was like dogfighting ghosts. The P-51s no longer engaged in drawn-out duels. They came fast, fired once, and vanished. The German fighters were too heavy, too slow, too broken to follow. Hager fired once more, blindly, and rolled hard to avoid tracers. A Mustang wingtip passed within 50 meters of his canopy. The roar rattled his teeth. His engine coughed. Smoke began leaking into the cockpit. He pulled away, losing altitude fast. Below him, the airfield was already burning. He landed short, wheels scraping on a patch of dirt and gravel that used to be runway. The moment the aircraft stopped, he jumped out, coughing black from his lungs. The plane wouldn't fly again, and neither would the 2 others that took off with him. One had vanished. The other exploded midair. He was alone. That night he stood at the edge of the airfield and watched the horizon. There were no flares, no distant artillery flashes, only the sound of a distant engine, steady, high, and unchallenged. A mechanic approached him, younger than 20, face caked in oil and soot. "They said we'll be getting me 262s next week." Hager didn't laugh, he just looked down. "They said that last month." The mechanic said nothing more. They both understood. The Me-262, the revolutionary jet, the wonder weapon, was a whisper, not a weapon, a myth told to soldiers at the edge of collapse. Even if they arrived, there would be no fuel, no parts, and nowhere to take off from. Germany wasn't losing. Germany had already lost. The next morning, he was given a rifle. They told him to prepare for a ground defense of the airfield. A rifle. He took it without speaking. Later that day, as he stood by a checkpoint of sandbags and wire, he watched a flight of 12 Thunderbolts pass overhead. They didn't even acknowledge the field. Didn't need to. There was nothing left to kill. He looked down at the weapon in his hands, bolt action, 5-round clip, no bayonet, and thought about the cockpit he would never sit in again. He thought about how many Thunderbolts he'd seen in 1 year, how many Mustangs, how many new pilots, fresh planes, fully fueled, fully loaded. Factories, endless, tireless, faceless factories. In Detroit, in Cincinnati, in Dallas, in Burbank. They hadn't beaten Germany with skill. They hadn't beaten it with luck. They'd beaten it with rhythm. Like a drumbeat that never stopped, the Americans had marched forward powered by machines that didn't sleep. By mid-April, the Luftwaffe command chain no longer functioned. Orders came days late, if at all. Supplies never arrived. Radios crackled with voices no one recognized. Hager scavenged his meals from abandoned storage sheds. He slept in the wreckage of a control tower. He hadn't flown in 11 days. The last aircraft that tried to take off from the field was hit by artillery before its wheels left the ground. Then the trucks came, American armored recon. He watched them through a crack in a concrete wall, olive drab steel rolling casually across ground he'd sworn to defend. They didn't even dismount, just kept rolling. There was no more war. One night, with no orders left to follow, Hager walked alone through the trees behind the base until he found an open field. He lay on his back, looking up through the clouds, waiting for the first contrail. It didn't take long. A high line, white, crisp, perfect, traced across the sky like chalk. He smiled, not bitter, not angry, just tired. "They never ran out," he whispered. He sat there until dusk. Eventually, a column of American troops arrived at the base. Young men in clean uniforms, rifles slung, alert but relaxed. One of them, a lieutenant, approached him with careful steps, holding out a canteen. Hager accepted it. "Were you Luftwaffe?" the American asked. Hager nodded, "Yes, once." The lieutenant looked around at the shattered aircraft husks. "Where is everyone?" "Gone," Hager said simply. "They went up, most didn't come down." The American offered a cigarette. Hager took it, lighting it with shaking hands. He hadn't smoked in days. After a long pause, he asked, "How many fighters did your country build this year?" The lieutenant thought a moment. "I think about 30,000. Hager let out a soft laugh, not from humor but from awe. "How many can one man shoot down?" The American shrugged. "Not that many." "That's what I learned," Hager said, "too late." They stood in silence together, staring at the twisted wreckage around them. The American finally asked, "Do you regret it?" Hager didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I regret believing we could outfight a nation that outbuilt the world." The American nodded. "That's what they keep telling us. It was the factories." "No," Hager said quietly. "It wasn't just that. It was the speed, the volume, the refusal to stop. You built planes faster than we could bury our dead." He dropped the cigarette, crushing it underfoot. "There's no countermeasure for that." May 1945, just outside Leipzig. Dietrich Hager walked through the remnants of a former Luftwaffe operations bunker. The walls were scorched black, desks overturned. Maps still pinned to corkboards flapped in the wind from a hole where the ceiling had collapsed. The floor was littered with yellowed papers, torn radio logs, twisted headset cords, and coffee cups turned into ash. There were no aircraft outside anymore. No engines, no fuel, just silence. He had surrendered days ago, not formally. There was no ceremony, no white flag, just the moment when he stopped looking at the sky and started looking at the road. American armor had rolled through the town square like tourists. They hadn't even stopped to fight. There had been no need. Everything had already fallen. He stepped into what had once been the squadron commander's office. The calendar still hung on the wall, the date frozen on April 3rd. That was the last day the base had received any new orders. Pinned beside it was a photograph, black and white, a formation of FW-190s in tight flight over the French coast. There was a handwritten caption, "Wir fliegen, egal was kommt." "We fly, no matter what comes." He stared at it for a long time, then tore it down. Outside, the wind carried the scent of spring, wet earth, blooming branches, diesel. Somewhere in the hills, a group of POWs worked with American guards clearing wreckage from the roads. They wore armbands now. He would join them soon. At the edge of the airfield, he sat alone on the wing of a shattered Bf-109, nose buried in a crater. Its propeller was twisted like paper. One wing had been blown clean off, but the frame still held, as if refusing to lie down. From his pocket, he took a piece of folded paper, the last intelligence summary he'd ever read. He didn't know why he'd kept it. It listed estimated Allied aircraft over Europe. P-47 Thunderbolt, 7,000 operational. P-51 Mustang, 6,400 operational. B Flying Fortress, 4,500 operational. B-24 Liberator, 6,000 operational. And below that, a handwritten addendum scrawled in pencil. Germany, -375 fighters combat ready. He crushed the paper in his hand, then opened it again. He forced himself to read it one more time. There had been a time when he believed in the strength of German engineering, in the will of the pilot, in the edge they carried through sheer skill. But even the greatest pilot could not outfly a factory. He looked skyward. The clouds were calm today, blue, open, forgiving. For once the sky was empty. And yet he could still hear it, that sound, distant, permanent, the roar of 1,000 engines passing in formation, not in memory, not in trauma, just in certainty. He remembered a battle long ago, one of his first. He had downed 2 Thunderbolts that day. His squadron had taken losses, but they'd returned alive, celebrated with warm schnapps, clapped shoulders, lit cigarettes under moonlight. But the next morning the Thunderbolts came back, in greater numbers, flying lower, with new pilots, fresh fuel, untouched by loss. They didn't mourn, they resupplied. That was when he first began to understand. The Americans weren't just flying to win, they were flying to outlast. The last dogfight he ever flew lasted 6 minutes. He didn't even see the plane that hit him. Just a burst of tracers, an impact to the engine, a trail of black smoke, and a dead stick landing into a barley field that crumpled his landing gear. The Mustang had never even circled to confirm the kill. It had already moved on to the next target, and the next. The war was not about him. It never had been. It was about numbers. Factories, fuel, transport, parts, tires, radios, wire, pilots trained by the thousands, ships delivering machine oil to ports he'd never see, seamstresses stitching canvas for flight suits in Ohio, assembly lines hammering rivets in Wichita, men and women he'd never meet, never imagine, all pouring themselves into the same goal, keep them flying. And Germany. Germany had tried to outfight it, tried to outmaneuver it, tried to build miracles at the last second. But no miracle could outrun velocity. That was what they had never understood. The Americans didn't build planes, they built momentum. He sat quietly, feeling the sunlight warm the back of his neck, and closed his eyes. The war was over. The silence was complete. But in that silence, the sky still whispered one final truth. They built fighters faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. And nothing, no courage, no ace, no legend, had ever stood a chance.